right, well, a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming to the center online. Carolyn Merrick, and I'm a program coordinator here, and I'll be hosting this event. Um, we would like to welcome all of our members and members of our community. If you haven't been to the center, we'd love for you to come. And thank you again for attending this evening's program, Reparations and Genealogy, an exploration into the nature of repair, with Briayna Cuffie and Lotte Lieb Dula. So what I'd like to do is present, we're presenting this in partnership with Charlottesville chapter of Coming to the Table. So I'll introduce you to Judith Minter, who will then introduce the rest of us.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you so much to the Center at Belvedere for partnering with us for this presentation tonight. Like she said, I'm Judith Minter, a member of the planning team for the local Coming to the Table group, along with Kathy Spar, Pam Maracini, Melody Pinnell, Donna Wally, and Diane Brown Towns, who has worked tirelessly to bring you this presentation tonight. What I will share with you now is a land acknowledgement and ancestral invocation that we read at our monthly second Saturday chapter meetings. This is adapted from one used by Dr. Melina Abdullah, who was one of the founders of Black Lives Matter in LA. The land we inhabit here is the original ancestral homeland of the Monacan Nation, who remain with us. We pay respect to the Monacan Nation and all the indigenous people, past and present and future, in their homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. We pay homage to those stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, falsely named chattel, and forced into unpaid labor, who were called slaves, but never submitted as such, who have always been fully human, with an unbroken connection to the divine and each other. We honor the African ancestors and their descendants today, who built what is now America. To both our African and indigenous forebears, we commit to the continued struggle for liberation and reparations, for it is only through freedom and justice that we truly give honor. For those of you who may not know about Coming to the Table, I'll give you a very brief description. In 2006 at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, the Black descendants and the white descendants of Thomas Jefferson and the Hairston family, which happened to be one of the largest plantation owning families in the South, decided to come together to live out Martin Luther King's dream, that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Thus was born Coming to the Table. We have over 50 chapters in the US today, along with the Virgin Islands, and we're open to all who are interested in racial justice in the United States. The mission of Coming to the Table is spelled out in the acronym TABLE, taking America beyond the legacy of enslavement. 4 pillars define our work: facing history and truth-telling, which we'll be doing tonight, making connections across racial lines, healing wounds by exploring how we can heal together, taking action to heal the wounds of racial inequality and injustice, and to support racial reconciliation. Both of our presenters tonight are members of the Coming to the Table, and that's where I met them just over a year ago. They will be introduced by Diane Brown Towns, also a member of the local Coming to the Table Planning Committee, and who I met several years ago in the Central Virginia Truth, Transformation, and Reparations Commission Planning Group, founded by UCARE, or University and Community Action for Racial Equity. Diane called the group to action at a meeting last July that resulted in the program we're presenting to you tonight. I'd like to present to you now Diane Brown Towns. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, Carolyn, and the Center at Belvedere for offering this platform to share the work of Lotte and Briayna. Facing history and truth-telling is important to the work of community healing. Without truth, can there be a meaningful and sustainable roadmap to repair? I heard Lotte Lieb Dula speak about reparative genealogy during the Truth-Telling Project's cohort, Building a Culture of Reparations, sponsored by activists in Ferguson, Missouri last March. I also attended a Liberation and Freedom Day webinar that featured a family that had been sold to various plantations along the northern fork of the Briayna River, in proximity to where our program is being brought to you this evening. Here's what I discovered. Sale at Ridgeway Plantation, August 13th, 1835. A 4-year-old girl's mother and 8-year-old brother were sold away to Verdant Green Plantation near Monticello. Her 12-year-old sister, Agnes Dickerson West, or Aggie, was sold to a man named Uriah Lieb, who purchased Monticello 1 year after Thomas Jefferson died. That 4-year-old child was my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Dickerson Brown. Edith, a Negro woman, 38 years old. John, a boy, 8 years old. Albert, about 10. Hannah, 6. Elizabeth and or Eliza, 4. Wilson, 1. A Negro woman named Rachel, about 16. Betsy, a girl, about 14 years old. Aggie, a girl, 12 years old. Seeing their names for the first time was liberating. Saying their names and acknowledging their pain is reparative. It connects me to their humanity. They once existed in space and time. Now they tell me that the torch has been passed on to me to tell their story, to set them free. Thank you for coming to the table to find out what we can learn together during tonight's presentation of Reparations and Genealogy, an exploration into the nature of repair. Welcome, Lotte and Briayna. After discovering that she was a descendant of slaveholders, Lotte Lieb Dula, retired financial strategist, founded Reparations for Slavery, a portal for white families wishing to walk the path of racial healing through making reparations. She's also involved with several reparative projects like Coming to the Table's Reparations Working Group and Reparations, an overdue conversation with members of the Denver Black Reparations Council. Briayna Cuffie is strategist, advocate, and future author based in Annapolis, Maryland. She leverages her political expertise, teachings from her elders, and history to help others understand the complexities of being Black in the United States. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from High Point University. She enjoys traveling nationally and speaks Spanish and Arabic when given the opportunity during her international travels. Lotte, please tell us about how you started your family research and what prompted you to design a 2-year-long workshop curriculum for white people who wish to commit to engaging in reparative change.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Judith and Carolyn. I'm delighted to be here to engage in this discussion with you, and I'm especially delighted to be here with Briayna, who is my partner in crime, and we've been working together for the last 4 years. I'm going to save my answer to that exact question for the presentation, which will slowly unfold, and you'll hear the answer. What I will say is that Bri and I are engaged in what I like to call a reparative relationship. And we're doing this across age. I'm double Bri's. Yeah, I'm more than double Bri's age. We come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and we live on, I'm actually from California, so we actually hail from different coasts. I mean, you couldn't find two people who you would consider more opposite than we are, and yet we have formed a really strong bond, and we've been working together ever since we met, and that's a story in itself. In 2018, when Bri overheard me making a really arrogant statement and rolled up on me and asked me a very simple question, and we've been working together ever since. So we can discuss that later in the Q&A, more information about that. Bri, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about reparations, about what we're doing together?
I love it. I feel like I describe it as a guinea pig situation. I think our approach to reparations is different. I think that's why so many people make their way to us, to a part of our classes and discussions, or just kind of to try to pick our brains for what we're thinking as they see different things in the news or unpacking things for themselves. But it's become a real big part of my life work and kind of a continuation of the elders' work that I grew up with, which I'll also note a little bit later as well. But it is definitely a path that was not a part of my life plan, but I am enjoying it so far.
All right, well, we're gonna go ahead and get underway. We're gonna start with a presentation that I'm gonna do on the nature of repair using some very bold language. So if you stand by, I'll go ahead and get my presentation going. After that, and what I'd like to tell people is just go ahead and some of you have seen this presentation before, but everybody who sees it 2 or 3 times comments to me, there's always something new that I noticed in the presentation. So if you've seen this presentation before, see what you are just noticing today for the first time. If you've got questions, put those in the chat. After that, we're going to go into Bree's discussion of genealogy. So we're going to be knitting the two together in ways that you may not expect. Then we'll have a Q&A, and we'll open it up, and we'll have a discussion together. So, all right, I'm going to see whether the technical gods are with me. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, and Bree will give me the thumbs up if I share the right one, etc. So stand by for just a moment. That looks about right, I'd say.
There we go.
Every once in a while it works right. I like that. All right. Well, good. Well, again, I just want to tell everybody, I really appreciate being able to speak to you tonight about reparations and genealogy, reparative genealogy. So tonight we're going to start, I'm going to speak about the economic basis for reparations, and I'm going to use my family's history of slaveholding as the backdrop for discussing how the racial wealth gap in this country came to be. We're going to also talk about how our family narratives help hold up structures of white supremacy, and how engaging in reparative genealogy and looking at these narratives can begin to unwind this harm. So again, go ahead and think of your questions as you're listening. Put your questions in the chat. Then we'll have a chance to answer as many as we can in the second part of our evening together here. Now, again, we're going to be using some really bold language in this presentation. I'm not pussyfooting around, so buckle your seatbelts and we'll get underway. Right, well, to start, I'd like to go ahead and get a simple definition of reparations on the table. Reparations is the idea that redress is due to African Americans for over 400 years of systemic racism. Now, this includes 250 years of enslavement, 75 years of legal barriers to Black economic progress, including Black codes and Jim Crow laws, and another 50 plus years of struggle for basic civil and human rights. Now, it's convenient for white people to think, oh, that was so long ago. We had the civil rights movement. Why can't African Americans just get over it? Well, the reason is simple. Slavery didn't end. It merely evolved into a complex system that almost guarantees that white people will have better opportunities for success than Black people will. Now, as a descendant of people who created and benefited from the institution of slavery, I developed this map so that I could begin to study how racism affects our daily lives in each of the areas listed to the left, and then find ways that we can begin to unwind the harm. Now, we don't have time to review all of these areas today. In fact, this is an entire class that Briayna and others teach, but I call these the vectors of economic racism. And you'll find more information about these topics on the reparationsforslavery.com portal that Briayna and I have created. Now, you're all aware of some of the systemic effects of racism that were born of our history of enslavement. But these phenomena are not unique to the US, nor is the movement for reparations itself. In fact, this movement is active around the world. Ex-colonial powers across Europe, including Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal, as well as Brazil and the US, are being called out for their roles in founding and perpetrating the transatlantic slave trade, which transported as many as 13 million Africans over 400 years to the Americas and the Caribbean. 4 million were brought to our shores from 1619 to the early 1800s in a slave trading triangle that included Africa, America, Europe, and the West Indies. Now, there was a very high mortality rate. At least 15% of enslaved Africans did not survive the voyage. And this does not count those that died while being forcibly marched to their embarkation points or died while in captivity here. We'll pause for a moment to read this excerpt from a letter from a ship's captain to an investor. In it, he says, one Negro woman marked Y on the left breast died in about 3 weeks after her arrival, in spite of medical aid which I procured. All the rest died at sea. I am sorry for your loss. It may have resulted from deficient clothing so early in the spring. Of course, this captain likely made an insurance claim on his loss. After all, the insurance industry was born of the slave trade. In 2016, a United Nations panel ruled that reparations is due to descendants of enslaved people all around the world. Now, the UN defines 5 areas of repair: restitution, which includes restoration of liberty and human rights and the return of property; compensation for damages, including physical harm, as well as lost opportunities and earnings; rehabilitation from the health and psychological effects of enslavement and institutional racism; satisfaction, or the cessation of human rights violations and abuses; the establishment of truth-seeking commissions; public apologies; and the establishment of sites to commemorate the history of enslavement; and finally, guarantees of non-repetition, the reforms needed to ensure the prevention of future abuse. Now, in the US, there are 2 major paths to repair. Most African American reparations groups are pushing for a national program of reparations. In fact, the official definition of reparations is nothing short of full remuneration to descendants of enslaved Africans. The other path to repair involves family and community reparations, which we refer to as personal partial reparations. Now, these are not substitutes for a federal program of repair, but they do represent steps you and I can take to begin to unwind the personal harm white families have perpetrated against Black families. And these are the first steps we need to take to begin the healing process this nation so desperately needs. There are 4 principles that can guide us on this path of repair. First, we need to be fearless in facing both our country's true history as well as our family's role within it. Next, in view of this history, we need to be willing to examine and reimagine our origin stories, or the narratives we tell about our families and communities, especially in regard to race and the generation of wealth. Next, we need to commit to engage with others across the racial divide in acts that will unwind harm and bring about repair. And finally, yes, you guessed it, we need to use our resources to invest our agency, our time, and our money, basically to invest in repair. Now, is this easy work? No way. But these are what the beginning steps of repair look like. And today we'll be focusing on healing our family narratives through reparative genealogy. For discussion, I'm going to show you how my family narrative is changing as I research and face my family's history and commit to repair. As you know, my name is Lotte Lieb Dula, and I'm a retired financial strategist. I host a portal called reparationsforslavery.com. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up hearing about my ancestors in the most glowing terms imaginable. I learned that I was a proud descendant of Colorado pioneers, that I was a descendant of true patriots, the very founders of our country, as well as immigrants who came here with nothing but the shirts on their backs in search of the American dream. Another narrative I grew up with expressed my family's very traditional values. I grew up believing that America was a meritocracy and that the playing field was level, both principles of fiscal conservatism. I'm sure some of you received the same messages growing up, right? I'm sure, especially this one: pull yourself up by your bootstraps. My journey began in 2015 when my mother, Peggy, died. I began the process of going through 30 boxes of family ephemera, with every box labeled precious, family treasure. Oh, I can tell you I had nightmares being buried alive in these boxes. It was a very long process, but I was so excited to learn more about my ancestors, who my mother had described so glowingly, especially my great-grandmother, Rebecca Jeanette Darrow Welch, who had been the genealogist for the Mayflower Society in the early 1900s. One of the first things I found was all of her notes on our family history. One of the first boxes I opened contained my grandmother Jeanette Welch's keepsakes. I found all sorts of cool trinkets. For instance, I was delighted to find photos of my grandmother dressed in costume as Robin Hood. And what fun to page through her 1907 Smith College yearbook and to see her suited up in a Victorian basketball uniform. I found that she had belonged to all sorts of quaint social clubs, and it was thrilling to realize that these early experiences formed my grandmother's lifelong passion for the arts, passion so many in my family share. But I also made a discovery that took my breath away. My grandmother had been a member of the KKK social club, as well as the Orangemen, two groups steeped in hate and racism. Now, it might have been very tempting to dismiss these pages as some lightweight sorority fluff, but as I considered my family's background and our pride in our heritage, my initial joy turned to a deep sense of unease. With some trepidation, I started going through my grandfather, William Paxton Carey's things. He had been a beloved judge, famous for his fairness. Surely there'd be nothing in Judge Carey's belongings to give me pause about my heritage. I hoped, anyway. I was amazed to find some mid-19th century daguerreotype photos, and with them a very nondescript looking little black book. I opened it, and I was thrilled to discover that the book belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, William Hayes Paxton. Now, as I paged through the book, I noticed the perfect penmanship and the neat rows of figures. You know, I'd often wondered, how does a finance person get born into a cultural arts family? I immediately felt a sense of kinship with my second great-grandfather as I paged through his business ledger. Ah, so this is where I got my business sense from. But as I turned the pages, it became clear that I was looking at inventory records for a Mississippi cotton plantation. I stopped cold as I read the inscription on pages 27 through 30. Loss of slaves by war. Each line had a name, age, and value. My heart froze. I was the descendant of slaveholders. Like many descendants, I had no prior knowledge of my family's true history in the South. That history had been conveniently erased, much like the history of slavery has been erased from our textbooks. But here it was, evidence that some of my ancestors had become millionaires in the Mississippi Delta, the majority of their wealth coming not just from land grants, but from the value of human chattel. What's become clear to me is this: as enslaved Africans were effectively building this country, my white ancestors were not only amassing wealth and social advantage, they were building the legal and economic structures that have prevented Black people from amassing wealth themselves. Now, in grade school, we all learned that we, the people, form the basis of our government. But as I continued my research, it was becoming apparent that we, the people, clearly meant we, the white people. I wanted to figure out how my family fit into this puzzle, so I did a bit of research, and here's what I found. It all started with Elisha Paxton, my third great grandfather. He established a plantation near Lexington, Virginia, beginning around 1815. From the late 1820s on, Elisha sent 6 sons to college, likely with proceeds amassed from plantation operations. Most of them attended Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Yep, that Lieb. At least 4 sons earned law degrees. In the early 1830s, several of Elisha's sons, including my second great-grandfather, moved to the Mississippi Delta near Vicksburg. There they set up a law practice with their uncle and later multiple cotton plantations, the same ones that were detailed in that ledger. This uncle, Alexander McNutt, became governor of Mississippi in 1837. He was a colleague of Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy. Here are 19th century maps of those plantations on Deer Creek near present-day Arcola, Mississippi. Now, most of these plantations eventually went bust, and my second great-grandfather, William, lost his shirt. But you know, it didn't even matter because he could still rely on his law practice to earn a living. Now, let's look at one of the adjoining parcels. Bolin Lucas and Jim Collier had both worked the Paxton plantations. Bolin Lucas, as an enslaved man, had been the Paxtons' trusted slave driver, while Jim Collier was a white overseer. After emancipation, they went into business together, bought a nearby parcel, and began farming. Jim Collier soon died. Upon his death, his estranged wife sued for possession of the land. And since Bolin Lucas was illiterate, Jim Collier's wife was able to deceive him and seize the land. Let's review the economic progress of white families, including my family, versus the people they enslaved. My family receives many, many land grants in Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Colorado, at least. I'm sure there are more. Enslaved people can't own land before 1865. Even from 1866 on, when they become eligible to apply for land grants under the Homestead Act, less than 2% of land grants are awarded to freed slaves. My family enslaves Africans to work on their plantations, becoming wealthy since they don't have to pay wages. Enslaved people are sometimes permitted to work side jobs, but as a whole, they are unable to amass wealth. Even after emancipation, Black codes, Jim Crow laws restrict what they can do, how much money they can earn, and how far they can travel. My family uses its wealth to pay for future generations' private education. Emancipated Africans are mostly illiterate since it's been illegal since 1829 for enslaved people to learn to read or write. After emancipation, they are barred from attending white schools, so with few resources, they must build their own. Now, despite extreme hardship, as we know, African-American families show great resilience. Some manage to amass savings, which they deposit into the Freedmen's Savings Bank when it's established in 1865. Unfortunately, in 1873, Congress, under controversial circumstances, mismanages the funds and it goes bust, losing 70,000 families' combined lifetime savings, $3 million, which is the equivalent of $47 million today. This setback has been considered the economic equivalent of extending slavery for another 10 years. My family has another advantage. When it comes to the transfer of wealth, our legal training gives us the ability to draft wills so that our heirs don't have to go through probate. Here's my second great-grandfather's will. It includes his real estate, dwelling houses, lots, and yeah, the cotton lands. Americans, on the other hand, have little access to legal services, nor do they trust white lawyers. Many are still illiterate and die without wills, and their property becomes heirs' property, a situation in which all living relatives inherit the property together, but individuals retain the rights to sell it without informing the other heirs. Since 1910, as much as 90% of Black-owned land has been lost due to legal treachery, as white developers and even local, state, and federal agencies dupe individual heirs or find legal loopholes to grab valuable heirs' property. As we head into the 20th century, does the playing field seem level to you? Next, let's look at the effects of programs that catapulted many white families, including my parents, into the middle class. 1933's Agricultural Adjustment Act aimed to help white farmers by cutting farm production and thus forcing up food prices. However, less production meant less work for thousands of poor Black sharecroppers who lost their rented land and their livelihoods. The Social Security net was created in 1935 in response to the Great Depression. By design, many Black workers were not covered, including farm and domestic workers. About 40% of Black people in the South are excluded. The establishment of the FHA in 1935 and Fannie Mae in 1938 gives white families the ability to finance and insure new homes, but Black families are effectively blocked from these programs due to race-related property covenants. Then there's the GI Bill. After World War II, many white families used proceeds from the GI Bill to get an education, start a business, or purchase a home. Now we know that Black veterans are blocked outright from receiving home loans, also business loans, but the same thing happens with the education benefit. Only 20% of Black veterans that apply are accepted into these programs. Again, despite all these economic roadblocks, some Black families are able to establish financially independent enclaves and neighborhoods. For instance, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Black Wall Street was the largest and wealthiest Black community in the US with its own banks, school system, public transportation, you name it. Much of this wealth was created based on lands that were granted by the 5 civilized tribes to Africans that they had enslaved. The land was granted at emancipation. When oil was discovered on these lands, many African Americans became wealthy. Yes, the freedmen prospered when given access to the same opportunities my white ancestors enjoyed. However, wherever there is Black excellence and prosperity, white supremacists attempt to destroy it. In 1921, a white woman accused a Black teenager on an elevator of touching her inappropriately. This resulted in the firebombing of the Greenwood neighborhood by the federal government. The 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre was last summer. Many gathered there to call for reparations. Now, this example is extreme, but it's not unique. Wherever Black prosperity has blossomed, there's been hell to pay, much of it disguised in the name of progress for generations. Result, by the 1950s, many white families have joined the middle class, while most Black families are held back. Today, a Black family's median net worth is just 1/10 that of a white family, and we can easily see why. Let's look at these factors again. How many of us know the history of economic racism? How many of us have bought the bootstrap argument without an understanding of our role in holding back Black economic development? Eric Hamilton and Trevon Logan are 2 economists that have aptly summarized the genesis of white wealth. It was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy and to some extent literal government giveaways that provided whites the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth. Or as Martin Luther King Jr. puts it, it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he should lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boot. All right, now we've taken apart the bootstrap argument, which has been used against Black people for their lack of economic progress. We've also rightly pinned some blame on owning class people like my enslaver ancestors. What about immigrants, though? For instance, how do my immigrant ancestors fit into this picture? Let's take another look at my family tree, this time on my father's side. My father's great-grandfather, Joseph Lieb, emigrated from Germany in the 1850s with his wife, Anna Maria Zeller-Grotz. They arrived in New York. He worked there for 5 years as a laborer, eventually saving enough money to move to Hebron, Wisconsin, establishing a farm there. My father grew up hearing rumors that the Liebs had shortened their name when they arrived in this country, and that they may even have been Jewish. Now, what binds Joseph and Anna Maria with the other Northern European immigrants is how they began the assimilation process, or what some racial justice advocates are now calling the process of becoming white. Through this process, Irish, Polish, German, Italian, and other immigrants gradually shed their cultural identities to fit in and work toward achieving the American dream. Many anglicized their names to avoid prejudice, and as was the case in my family, marry into long-established patrician families. What common trait enables them to do this? Being light-skinned. How do Jewish immigrants fit into this puzzle? Well, this issue is quite complex. On the one hand, Jewish people and African Americans are both known for their resilience and accomplishments despite intense and unrelenting oppression. On the other hand, Jewish people who flee persecution in Europe and gradually ascend to the middle class in America also share some of the benefits many ascribe to whiteness, though not all identify themselves as white. British author Thomas Harding has had a recent experience that perfectly illustrates this paradox. His Jewish ancestors fled Germany, leaving their home to escape Nazi persecution. A few years ago, Thomas was researching his heritage and discovered that the house his family had left near Berlin was still standing. Thomas met with the German family who now lived there. They acknowledged the crime and gave Thomas back his family's historic home. In effect, Thomas received reparations, much like we're discussing today. Now, this is possible because of the German admission of guilt in the Holocaust, an admission that the US has not made with regard to the crime of 250 years of slavery. More recently, Thomas was researching another line of heritage. In the early 1800s, his family had started one of the largest catering companies in the world, which also happened to sell tea and tobacco. He discovered that much of his family's wealth had come from importing tobacco and other crops grown on Virginia plantations by enslaved Africans. Remarkably, though Thomas was owed reparations on one side of his family, he realized that he himself owed reparations on the other side. Ultimately, the Jewish connection to slavery, however, is minuscule. The Christian faith plays a much larger role in this country's history of enslavement. Christians, many fleeing religious persecution in England and elsewhere, migrate to our shores, beginning the process of colonization. Their ranks include both Catholics and Protestants and their many offshoots. Another paradox soon emerges. While firmly standing for principles of religious and economic freedom, many of these divergent religious movements also support the enslavement of Africans. My 10th great-grandfather, George Calvert, for instance, establishes the province of Maryland in 1632 as a safe haven for Catholics fleeing religious persecution in England. However, my ancestors also seek to amass wealth and soon see the economic advantages of planting tobacco. By 1660, they passed laws making slavery legal in Maryland, adding a new concept. In Maryland, slaves will be considered slaves for life. Tobacco plantations and the business of the slave trade soon become the economic engine of the region. What act sets the stage, giving my 10th great-grandfather the divine right to do these things? In 1452, the Catholic Church gives Portugal and Spain full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate unbelievers, wherever they may be, and reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. 40 years later, another papal bull is issued, the Doctrine of Discovery, in 1493. These two acts set the stage for the church to bring terror and subjugation to millions of people around the world for hundreds of years to come. Well, fantastic, right? Okay, so we've learned that our nation's history may be far more complicated than we thought. We've learned that white families, regardless of when we arrived, likely have some involvement, either directly or indirectly, with the institution of slavery. Even our faith communities have participated in a major way. Now, where do we go with this information? What do we do? A really powerful place to start is uncovering and transforming our origin stories. This is one of the simplest yet most compelling things white families can do as we begin down the path of repair. Much of our national narrative centers around the white myth of being self-made and the supposed superiority of white people to people of other races. Black trauma can be traced to laws enacted to provide economic advantages to white people and to the selected erasure of this history. In taking apart and rebuilding our own family, community, and institutional narratives, we begin to unravel the myth of white supremacy and thus begin to change our national narrative from the ground up. I'll say it again because it's worth repeating. Until white people confront the truth and begin to change our origin stories to match the narratives Black families have been telling for 400 years, until we begin the truth-telling process, this nation cannot heal from its wounds. Further, all white families, regardless of economic class or immigrant background, need to look at our narratives. And once we've engaged in this truth-telling process, we must find a way to engage spiritually and to atone for these harms. Ultimately, despite our differences, what knits all of us together is our pursuit of the American dream. However, buying into the American dream is no different than buying into a business. The balance sheet contains both assets and liabilities. As someone who may have inherited my financial skills from a slaveholding ancestor, I can tell you the liability for engaging in 400 years of systemic racism has now come due. Right. I want to end by saying that, our goal in doing this work is nothing less than the transformation of our society and the creation of the equitable future so many of us long for. Reparative genealogy is one way we can break down the walls that ancestors like mine built to keep us apart. And in engaging in repair, we begin the process of healing ourselves and of making our communities whole. Thank you. If you're like me, you might have been holding your breath that whole time. Let's take just a couple breaths together. Thank you.
My turn. Are we doing a little Q&A in between?
Handing off to Diane.
Well, if you're, I was looking over your biography, Bree, and in your biography, you mentioned the complexities of Blackness in America. Does that mean that your elders taught you about being a Black American or being Black in America? Please describe how their teachings apply to reparative genealogy.
I learned about being Black in America. There is a big emphasis on, Blackness not being, we've had to create a culture for Blackness because ours was taken from us. But the complexity for me comes from the fact that the earlier generations of my family, depending on the arm, the more mulatto, the lighter they are. And it's not until kind of my grandfather's generation where people really get darker. The other piece of complexity is our family's so rooted in Maryland. I am back to between 1803 and 1823 on multiple lines, and we're still in Maryland across 5 counties, and that's on my paternal and maternal sides. And Maryland is and still is a very pick and choose state, what kind of aspects of the North it wants to have, what kind of aspects of the South it wants to have. When you look at policy, even today, and I say that as someone who's worked in our state legislature and work in our politics now. And so that complexity has always been a part of what I learned from my elders about the state of our existence in our state.
Well, I open the floor up to anyone to place questions in the chat. And if you have any further piece of your presentation that you'd like to speak about before we open the floor, I'd welcome that. On reparative genealogy.
I added Lotte back to the spotlight just in case anyone had any specific ones for her. Okay. I did want to dive a little bit into the one question that I saw Selena had dropped in. Lotte's presentation addresses them both kind of a little bit, but for me, I think that my response is, of course, a little bit different when you talk about categories of whiteness and, but my family never owned slaves. So for the first thing, I dropped it in the chat, the questions, it comes to 2 questions for me. One, how do you know for sure? Because a lot of the white people that I've grown up knowing my entire life, and even the ones that I work with now, they don't really know their origin stories. They know, the short segments of family lore, but when we're talking the extensive, going back through the family lines like Lotte and I have been doing together the last few years, people haven't done that. They haven't parsed through that information. And so you really don't know for sure whether or not they did, unless you've done that work. And then number 2, I've actually talked through this with generally Ashkenazi Jewish folks, actually. The complicity of being able to fall into the fold of upholding white supremacy. It becomes a question of complicity because you then, in even to an extent, other brown immigrants say you get to buy into the American dream and be different from those of us who have already been here. And buying into the American dream means buying into anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And that still comes through even with other immigrants of color and even honestly Africans that immigrate here. There's a stark line between us Black people here and them when they come here. They learn very quickly to make the lines and not want to be treated like us. And so there's a piece of coming here and, you know, not owning slaves, or weren't here bringing slavery, but there's still an aspect of upholding white supremacy and buying into whiteness that can't usually is inescapable. I won't say it can't be done, because some people, you know, right mindset from the jump. I haven't found any yet, but that is usually inescapable.
I would add to that you're describing me 5 years ago. I didn't know I had any kind of background like that, and I would have argued with anybody who told me that I did. It wasn't until I really did the deep dive, and also just last year, Briayna and I are actually we're kind of like we have kind of an evil sense of humor, so we're always joking back and forth. And so one of the jokes was, "Hey, we've been working together. I wonder if we're related. I guess I should check to see if I have any Maryland ancestors." And lo and behold, I'm a Calvert descendant. And Bree's family is literally, I can trace my family within, you know, a stone's throw of Bree's.
Yeah, I think it's not even like a 20-mile difference.
No, exactly. So we call it linked in coming to the table. We are linked descendants. We are linked together through slavery. So the powers that be, the ancestors, have brought us together to do this work. And I just can't tell you how my life has been transformed through this process. I think you can tell through the presentation, but it's been just an enormous journey. My life has opened wide up. And I've never, as painful as it is to realize my real history, which does not match what I was taught by my ancestors, or even the notes they left are just wrong. I have the ability to bring healing through this work and to undo the harm my ancestors left. Such a brilliant trail for me. I can see all the things that they've done because they were genealogists and left a trail of data and information. So anyway, so I just want to say that this is a very deeply reparative journey to go on. And when you are able to link up with someone across age, race, class, I just can't tell you how powerful an experience it is.
I thought about that story that we talked about a few months back, about the woman that talked about her Ellis Island experience and how she was able to lift herself up from her bootstraps. And then you had that conversation with her. Would you go that a little bit, share that with our attendees?
Whose story was that?
It was a woman who talked about how she was able to make it after she came, you know, it was an Ellis Island story, and that she was able to, she didn't really understand why Black people or anyone else can't make it and lift themselves up from their bootstraps. And you gave a comparative to say, I mean, if you made her think about what she was saying, you encouraged her to think about what she was saying. But anyway.
It's a conversation I have literally almost every day because people come up with those stories, and invariably it's people who've not really looked at their family narrative in this way and compared the narrative to history. And none of us were raised with a true account of history that looks at these issues. None of us were. So, you know, we're in our second year of a reparations course with Coming to the Table. Actually, it's the Denver chapter, but we're kind of more national than that. And it's a story that repeats on a daily basis. Both Black and white attending saying, wow, we really don't know our history. And if white people, if we begin to speak about our history in a way that lifts up our Black colleagues' stories rather than pushing them back down again and saying gaslighting, we use a lot of gaslighting, then there's healing there. People feel seen. Bree, do you have comments about that whole process?
I think with regard to the Ellis Island story, I feel like that was the notion of being able to to move to America and start a new life in Ellis Island was presented to me as a farce at such a young age. Because it's nowhere near our experience, even for my more mulatto elders, who clearly are descendants of Calverts and Carrolls, and still holding those surnames, and just from the people that I match with on DNA. Yeah, I give a lot of people food for thought, so I am told, when they bring up the bits of family lore, like that woman's experience and what she noted to Lotte during that presentation. But it's a more awkward conversation, I think, with me, because the blessing and curse that I have is the elders that even just the ones that I've grown up with, I can almost counter, almost tit for tat experiences, and no one's ever prepared for that.
Looks like we have a question. Laura Hill asked, why do you think that your family's narratives as slaveholders was concealed? Why do you think that they hid that that ledger you found? Was it something that anyone talked about in your family? You said you didn't know anything about it. Not many people shared that information. Why do you think it was concealed?
That box had been buried for 100 and however many years, just passed from generation to generation. Nobody had opened it, clearly. Nobody. It's our family version of the lost cause mythology. You know, let's reinvent the story so that we don't have to admit. Honestly, just some heinous crimes. One of the longer version of this presentation, I talk about an ancestor who basically tried to destroy the Reconstructionist government in New Orleans. Went in with a gun and started shooting people, and that's in 1877. Nobody talks about it. That would be a pretty important point to pass down, except you don't want to tell that side of the story. You want to tell he was a brilliant businessman, he was the salt of the earth. We just don't get the real story. My mother was a member of United Daughters of the Confederacy, and she swore up and down that she was not a racist. She said, no, it's a cultural group. I said, Mom, no, it's a racist institution. No, it's just a cultural group. They bought the line because it benefited them. And my mother didn't really want to look at these kinds of stories. She really didn't want to look inside. And I find this is really true, especially, this is going to sound, well, some of you will recognize this, especially liberals will tell these stories to make ourselves feel good. I come from a very conservative family, but my parents rebelled and became, somewhat less conservative than their parents were. And yet underneath that, there was a very strong element of racism, but they hid behind these progressive values and these mythological stories. So I hear the same story. Every time I tell this story, I hear it reflected in everybody else's story. It's the same. And yet, if you do this research, I also hear to a person, I've never met another white person who had not gone down this road, done the research, started talking to someone like Briayna, and put the pieces of puzzle together and did not come to the conclusion that reparations are due. That's where I go with this, is reparations are due. And it starts with me. It starts with who I am in everyday life. Whether or not we ever get a national program to look at the 10-to-1 racial wealth gap to repair that, fine, I'm working toward that too. But on a daily basis, I'm working with Briayna. I'm working with other white people to try to unwind this harm through truth telling. And along the way, we can work on reparative projects together as they appear, and they always appear. As soon as you start working across race, class, geography, magic happens.
It looks like Donna Wiley asked, and Briayna answered her, but she was directing the question, I believe, to you, Lotte. Most people don't have the wealth of information about their families that you have. have only been able to find information back to my great-grandparents, all of whom immigrated in the late 19th or early 20th century, and all of whom came out of poverty from either England or Italy. So what do you, how do you, is there something that your workshop provides that would help people who aren't able to find that dearth of information that you've been able to find?
Well, yeah, we teach, Bree and I do teach a workshop. It's a 5-session workshop for both Black and white people to come together, to do it together, to begin unwinding this mystery. And yeah, we have usually an even distribution of people who can trace their families back to slavery era, and other people who are immigrant people coming in. And what we like to do is, I like to ask, all right, so my ancestors got here first. What did my ancestors hand yours that made your trajectory happen in this life? One of the questions, if you take the class, you'll get this exercise. One of the exercises is, all right, if your family, let's say your family arrived here in 1864, your white family, tell your origin story. Yes, my Swedish ancestor arrived here with only a needle and thread. I mean, we all have that story, right? our hard luck story, or coming here with nothing. So I say, well, okay, what if your white family had been Black and you arrived in 1864? Could you have even arrived here? Would you have been allowed on the ship? No. Okay, let's say you snuck onto the ship. Where would you be? Oh, with the animals in steerage, with the bilge water. Okay, then once you got off the ship, what would be happening then? Oh, we would be captured and our family would be split up. Okay, so now are you going to start your washerwoman business now? It's like, nope, we're toast. So if you look, depending on when you arrive, let's say it's during Reconstruction, my family would not be allowed to vote. We only 2% of us can buy land. I mean, you go through all these elements of history, and if you exchange yourself for an African American, you will see the difference, and that's how you can back into what your benefit is. I had a woman in a church stand up and say, "Oh my God, yeah, my Swedish second great grandmother arrived here. Literally, all she could do was sew. She walked into a hotel and said, look, your drapes are a mess. If I can repair them, I'm going to do it for free. And then you hire me if you like the work." And they hired her and she had a job. And the woman stood up and said, if my ancestor had been Black, none of that could have been possible. It is my white skin that made the difference. Even though, yes, my family worked as hard as anybody. That's all true. And the white skin is what made the difference.
Briayna, you were chatting, you were addressing someone in the chat.
Oh yeah, I noted the questions are kind of veering into the like reparative genealogy piece. So I was just noting that I'll be addressing that once Lotte wrapped up. So some of the questions that are starting to come up in people's minds, I might tap into with my presentation.
Okay, all right. Well, did you want to go ahead and transition to that right now?
Yeah, let me get this up here. And share the screen here. Oh, come on. Okay. All right, so I'm going to dive into the reparative genealogy piece of this, and some of our questions are kind of veering that way. And a little bit of this, you'll kind of notice a little bit of overlap, just because since we're essentially a bi-coastal team, we sometimes have to do this solo when we are doing in-person things. And so I will note too that, and I actually have a meeting about this tomorrow, our reparative genealogy concept program has been picked up by a museum here in Maryland. So I actually have a meeting with them tomorrow. We launched it in November and are going to be keeping that moving throughout the rest of this year. So moving on. I do want to harken back to the focus and the word reparations, the concept of reparations. It's not new. HR 40 and the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, that's not new. It has been in existence as long as I have on this earth, honestly, at this point. You know, I could go on and on about how many things related like to making those who were slaves or descendants whole, but I'll save that. So one thing I do want to say, and let me move this here, make sure I have my notes here. There we go. And I'm sure, I feel like you probably got a hint of it a little bit from Lotte's presentation, but when we talk about reparations, at least for me, and I've noticed it in some of the conversations and sessions that we have with people, we're really looking at the root of the word. Repare, repair, or they want to go with the more Latin version of it, or just the repair aspect. And that for us comes in many forms, which is why we do the work that we do. So what is reparative genealogy? It is the act of researching our heritage, acknowledging our connections to colonialism, slavery, and daylighting the history of our ancestors. Fun fact, we may or not have almost named it Genealogy for Dummies. Figured we would come up with a better name. And so this is the team. This is the two of us. These photos we took last summer, so almost a whole year ago. Last May, I went out to Colorado. We were getting interviewed for a French documentary about racial justice and social justice in the US. And that was really the first time that we had been together again in person since we first met in 2018. So it was a fun kind of little mini retreat to have and to be able to share space in that way again together, since we've been doing it essentially via Zoom and FaceTime and text message since then. I know she mentioned being from California, and so I would say we're bi-coastal, but she's landlocked, so I feel like I can't really call it bi-coastal. So that is the two of us. And so I'm going to jump right into our 2021 web series. The last year we did, the 5-session series that Lotte had just mentioned. And I see stuff in the chat. Let me know, do I need to leave it alone? Okay, I'll leave it for now. I'll look at it after. But our 2021 web series, it was about 2-hour sessions. Of course, did them via Zoom. Everyone's attuned to Zoom, Google Meet, and all that these days. We always made sure there was time for question and answers. We had about 25 active participants throughout all the sessions. And from my last count, we had participants from at least 5 different states. So to session 1, kind of amateur genealogy overview, and I'll dive deeper into these in the coming slides. Session 2, we really focus on ancestry.com. We make note of some of the other ones that we kind of dally with, but the root of really all the work, the legwork that we do is on Ancestry. It's kind of arguably been around the longest, and it's what people are most familiar with and comfortable with, or at least comfortable with working through. And so we talk about the kind of basics of that. Session 3, avoiding common mistakes like copying people's trees. You never know if they're wrong or need some tweaking. It's very enticing to do, but it's not always the best thing to do. Session 4, we talk about repatriating documents, and I think someone had mentioned that in the chat too while I was looking at it. And then session 5, we really take the time to kind of focus on us, which it came to our attention last summer when we were together getting interviewed, that we never really do that, at least not to the extent that people expect. And so we really talk about our relationship, and especially how that has grown through genealogy. She mentioned being a Calvert descendant. When she did go to take a look back at her tree, I remember her texting me about it and asking, what do you know about the Calvert family in Maryland? And I, of course, cackled and was like, you mean the original colonizers of my state? What do you want to know? Of course I know who they are. And so that started a whole new rabbit hole and a whole new understanding of kind of why we are where we are in our relationship and in our work. So moving forward with that, about some of the sessions. Why are we not going? Okay, here we go. So the first session was very intro, just giving people an overview of what our plans are and all of that. And so I don't talk too much just about the first session, since it's kind of setting the stage. Session 2, we talk about, getting your notebooks ready. How do you want to attack uncovering your family history? So vital records, oral histories, family ephemera, that box that's been handed down where you just, someone passes away, you're given the box, and so you shove it away and never actually look at what's in it. Choosing your tree building platform, whether you're going to use Ancestry or something like Roots Magic or 23andMe, talking through some of those, and then talking about the cost and the option of working with genealogists and not just hobbyists like the two of us, not just a seasoned hobbyist like the two of us. So talking through kind of what all their options are. For the third one, we brought in our partner genealogist Sharon Morgan. Her expertise is very much in Black history and doing Black family lines. She looks at probate records, wills, and estates. She looks at all documents I had never even heard of and didn't even know existed. So that was something for me to learn as well. We talk about building and expanding and fixing family trees. So, how to make sure it's kind of as clean and clear as it can be for not only you, but for people you end up showing it to, like your family members, or for other people who are doing their research and come across your tree. Finding slaveholders in family trees. Everyone kind of has a different way of how they either acknowledge them or don't acknowledge them, how they label them or don't label them on their trees. Chronicling slavery era documents, uploading those into those databases of those sites, connecting those to the applicable folks in the family tree, and making sure those are searchable for other people who use the site. Which goes to one of the questions that had been dropped in the chat of how to make sure, other people have access to that, if in case their ancestors are, on those slave inventory records. And then coping with the knowledge and the reality of slaveholding, or in some people's cases, the being complicit in white supremacy in a different way. Session 4, we kind of really continue that conversation in my mind with more of a focus on the Black aspect. So what you can do repair-wise for that. So where you can take those documents aside from just updating them to Ancestry and things like that, what else can you do to really kind of bridge that gap and really, and honestly, for some people, work through the acknowledgement of the existence of these records themselves. And so one of the things that came to mind for me, and a lot of that focuses on what has come to mind for me and what I've been working through in chronicling my own community and my own ancestors, just some of the non-traditional places people tend to not think about, in places I can give them. So Black churches, those were kind of our first houses of our records, since not too many people cared to keep record of us elsewhere aside from personal records. The assortment of genealogy Facebook groups and websites. I learned what I feel is late in the game about my county having a historical and genealogical society. Of course, there aren't many people in it that look like me, but I'll be fixing that now that I am on the board of it. And then, of course, archives and museums. People are dying to have someone help them catalog photos, documents, or what have you, and getting more context into what they already have and getting additional information. In session 5, like I mentioned, we do talk about our relationship, and then we tackle DNA tests a little bit. People, of course, ask us that regularly, if we've done DNA tests, how we feel about them, what we recommend. And so we talk through that a little bit. I feel like I have done every DNA test under the sun that I feel will be helpful. And then making contact and connections. ideas for reparative action, you know, of course, speaking from kind of the I and we experience, speaking for the two of us, and what we're actively doing, our reparative relationship. We have no problem talking about the financial piece of it. And then also kind of what I see just even in my local community, where that investment of time, money, resources, what have you, whatever people do have available to them, where that can go and what that can mean for quality of life for people that look like me. And so after we did this series and we were really bringing it all together, I went back to some of our participants, and we had about maybe about a 2/3, 1/3 split, maybe more like 40-60 between white and Black. And so I asked a few people who participated in it, you know, what was the impact for them on being a part of that series, you know, what they got out of it. And the responses very much overlapped. I got almost the kind of the same answers from white and Black participants. So, you know, the opportunity for fellowship and camaraderie, it's diving into work like this can feel very lonesome. Whether you're liberal, conservative, really interested in it, or, you know, just finally got to the point where you want to take the leap, knowing that there are other people who are taking that leap at the same time or around the same time, and you can commiserate or share joys, was a really good and kind of the first thing that a lot of people mentioned to me. The tips and tricks. Lotte and I do a lot of trial and error ourselves. And so when people go to, you know, make their first attempt, it's like, okay, well, this, and this will come up. Don't do that. Like you will waste time. And so trying to keep people on the straight and narrow, if you will, new skills and techniques. One of the things that I introduced to Lotte was doing trees laterally, horizontally. So, you know, making sure you also have in your direct ancestor siblings. That brings up more hints, leaves on ancestry and whatnot that can lead you to additional information about your direct ancestors. And for Black folks, you know, that kinship piece is very important, and really can lead to some important pieces about migration patterns. People really feel like they got a solid education out of it. It's not your traditional thing you learn how to do, is, you know, doing a family tree and tracing ancestors, and just, you know, the importance of cross-checking family lore. You know, what's missing from those family stories. And so same thing with the participants of European descent. The big two things I'll mention here, because you'll see the other three really are the same, but the additional or like alternative act of repair that was offered, people never really thought about tracing their own ancestry being a way to, you know, repair harm, you know, being able to be a part of that puzzle piece, filling in those gaps, seeing that as an act of reparations. And of course, new skills and techniques, fellowship, education. And this quote of "it's the least I can do," I heard that from at least 3 people, where they're like, you know, some of the folks that, you know, they don't have that inherited wealth, or at least not to the magnitude that a lot of people think is required to be able to make personal reparations. They're like, if this is, you know, low stakes, low cost, simple thing I can do, and it can be considered an act of repair and help other people along the way, solid. Like that's the least I can do. And so the last piece I usually talk about when talking about reparative genealogy, because I try to keep it short. I feel like I've probably feel like you're learning via water hose here, but the impact that reparative genealogy can have on a community. So this is a screenshot from my mom's ancestry account, because I use hers to do our tree. But so sometimes I message from her, just don't want to freak people out. But I have been working in the last 2 years interviewing elders. So I've interviewed upwards of 50 people over 4 generations. So our oldest being 100, almost 101, and the youngest being 52. About the Black history of our town that goes untalked about, is uncatalogued, just doesn't exist, essentially. And I did my own kind of little piece of reparative genealogy and looking at the Ashkenazi Jewish grocer's family. he would not have been able to stay in business without our community, but he also definitely upcharged our community more than necessary. So he was really making some money off of them. But for them, he was also the only grocery store in our town that they were allowed to shop at. So they very much needed each other. But I, in doing my kind of own active reparative genealogy, looked into his tree and just to kind of get an idea of what this man looked like, because not too many of my elders could really explain him to me. I also wanted to learn his real name because they, of course, had a nickname for him in the whole 9 yards. And so when I found him on, it was the only tree on Ancestry that he was on. I was able to trace him, his ancestors back to when his great-grandparents immigrated here from Romania and Lithuania. Kind of on the cusp of the beginning of a lot of the pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia, and be able to track them to when they got to our town. And I messaged the person, on Ancestry, and just to, extend a branch, wanted to ask, and they were more than happy to do email correspondence. I spoke with them a couple of times on the phone. His great-granddaughter had no clue the impact that he had on nourishing literally hundreds of Black people across 70 years. And so there's a lovely coming together of that, where she, of course, still doesn't know the term reparative genealogy, I'm sure, but that's an impact that even had on her, while it also, of course, selfishly helped me with teasing things out for my community. It's an impact for her as well. And so I tend to end mine. We actually have a version of this where Lottie's also ends with this chessboard. The question of, is your family history, and kind of doing this work, is as simple as checkers or as complex as chess? I say that, and I posit that to people just because my life certainly has not been simple. The same can be said for most people I know. With some of the death records, cemetery records, censuses, just what I have been able to look at, find, uncover, and piece together the last few years, so much of what my mom and my grandfather thought were simple, I've teased out for them, and it's much more complex than they thought. And they have just been mind blown at how much they didn't fully have the context of something that they were literally living in and living through, and the people they were living with. And of course, while we're able to recognize or avoid the complexity of our own lives, people often tend to think of their forebears in simpler terms, if they even think of them at all. I know I mentioned earlier how a lot of people don't really know past basic family lore, what their ancestors were doing, where they came from, and all of that. And so there's a lot of factors in how our lives have played out and how they can play out in the future. And so reparative genealogy for us really comes out a way for people to play a role in that. For people to engage in reparative genealogy, at least and I'll speak from my perspective here, it really speaks to some of the feedback back from the participants of, one, a no or fairly low cost of repair, the cost of having an Ancestry membership. 2, to be able to contribute to literally history, historical knowledge, because you get to add more clarity to what was going on by being able to say, no, because I've got records here that show when it comes to my ancestors, X, Y, and Z was also happening. And then 3, gain a more encompassing understanding of yourself, which really affects how you go about making repair in your own communities, in your own families, or just how you approach or think about things. So I will stop myself there. I will stop the share, and I will see what's been going on in the chat, since it looks like I've missed some notifications.
I think for another question, it looks like Rosalind wants to know, either Lotte or Briayna, do you hear from white people who would be willing to share their family's slaveholding history with African Americans, but don't, for fear of being verbally shamed, attacked by family descendants? How do you prepare folks for these discussions?
Oh, I can start with that. I feel like Judith may remember. We talked about it a little bit in one of the coming to the table meetings we were facilitating. Was it's as awkward of an experience to be on the receiving end if you're going to initiate that conversation with someone. It's awkward on both sides, I think. I think the fear, only to an extent, is valid, but I think it's not the fear that white folks think it is, at least for us on the receiving end, because we know it in our bones, but a lot of us also know it from family lore of experience. And so it's more of a validating thing, and that's kind of the perspective I bring to it. I reach out to white people hoping they have something that they want to share. Like, so if they've been holding on to it, I'm like, do you want to give it to me? Please do. And I think people never prepare themselves that could also be the reaction that they get.
I'm gonna go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, I've got a comment also about, there are a couple questions about guilt and shame, how do you overcome guilt and shame? And my analogy is, let's say I'm walking down the street and there's Bree and I bump into her and she falls over and her purse goes rolling down the street or whatever. Am I going to stand there saying, oh, I feel so guilty? Or am I going to go run after, pick up her packages, get her purse? Are you okay? Oh, here, let me give you a coat. Do you need to go to the doctor? You're going to take care of the person that you injured. It's very simple. And so if you're thinking about yourself in terms of the harm, what it means is your eyeballs are flipped inside your head. You need to flip them back out and look at the harmed party. And that's what the focus should be on, not on us. And as soon as you do something, it's magic. As soon as you stop focusing on yourself and start focusing on what can I do, then magic happens. And also, this is going to sound weird, but it can be fun. Bree and I are having, you might have noticed, we kind of have a lot of fun working together. And yeah, we go through some heavy duty stuff, but we also have fun, which who would expect, right? This is supposed to be very serious stuff, but you can end up with really good friendships with people who have the wackiest things in common, like we like the same kind of shoes. I mean, just weird things that we have in common. And so we actually have a lot of fun in our friendship.
People are always surprised when, they go to ask, oh, well, when you talk to Lotte next, I'm like, oh, well, I'm texting with her right now. Like, I'll just ask her, I'll just tell her.
Yeah. So guilt and shame can be easily transformed by the simplest action. And honestly, going on Ancestry and pinging somebody, you might only 50% of the chance, like even if I'm pinging other white people, maybe 50% of the people will respond to me. So you never know what you're going to get, but many people are friendly. I mean, Bree has been able to get some remarkable connections from slaveholders that want to share information. Right off,
I'm just cold emailing people.
You're fearless. So both of us are fearless at this point, and it's really paid off. And if you mess up and trip, you just make a joke, stand up, dust yourself off, and try it again.
I was gonna say that, or you lean into the awkwardness where it's like, well, having this conversation sucks. Like, let's talk about something else now. Especially with some of the stuff that we've been doing recently. And I wanted to ping back to what Hyatt had mentioned, because she had brought up the notion of shame and guilt. I think my mean answer is that Black people don't have time to entertain your shame and guilt. So you got to work through that. That's an affinity group type of thing. That's something to work through with other white people. You can't bring that to me. I already got generations of trauma and everything else. I can't also be holding space for you to cry about finally seeing that someone is a slaveholder. I have the bandwidth for it. Most Black people are not going to entertain that. And it's not the best use of our time either. And then one of the things I know Ellen had mentioned, and I said I was going to kind of talk about it a little bit, the quick reactions about reparations are just about paying the money. I feel like that's very much a talking point that people get, just because the only thing they've really heard about reparations is usually either HR 40 or 40 acres and a mule. And most people also don't fully understand the 40 acres and a mule, because when you read the order, 40 acres was not promised to every Black enslaved person. They're promised to a certain select, I guess, demographic of enslaved folks in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Low Country. My ancestors would not have been entitled to 40 acres, and the mule was to be lended for you to be able to get back to your land. So most people also don't fully understand that financial piece of reparations either, which is why we kind of take a different approach to it, where it's, what can you be doing in the meantime while, wait for the government to do what it's supposed to be doing to remunerate Black folks, the descendants of enslaved people. What can you be doing to essentially build the case for reparations in live time for that?
So we're thinking about having you come back to do a workshop. How is that? Is that usually a little more interactive with the audience? And what does that entail? And do you start delving into some actionable plans that we here in this community can start thinking about implementing?
I feel like it's kind of part presentation, part coaching in a way, because some people ask very personal questions of what they have had as far as trial and error themselves. And I feel like this partially relates to what Laura had just dropped in the chat too. Programs to help people, Black and white, who are not in a financial position, have an Ancestry.com subscription or needed resources. One of the big things I note to people, and I make a big point of telling people that I use my mom's account. It's a family account at this point, because why are we both going to pay Ancestry if she's already paying for it and we're working on the same tree? So she shares her login with me and I use it that way. It's one way to keep costs down, especially if you've got multiple family members who are interested in doing the work. And you can make multiple trees so that not everyone's in yours or messing yours up. The other piece is libraries. People forget about that access to public libraries with usually, and I know all of mine do, and I think a couple of the ones in DC, and I want to say at least 2 in Virginia, you can use your library account to get a free account with Ancestry. Or if sometimes it involves physically using the library computer to be able to open up those documents and stuff. But that might be a trip. I mean, that sounds like a trip worth taking if that means you can then download census records and all of that, because once you do have access to those, the documents that are accessible through the paid subscription, I download them. I have them all saved to my desktop in Google Drive and OneDrive. If my mom never reinstates her Ancestry account again, I still have access to those records because I've saved them.
Yeah, the only other question, or the only other thing I would say is, we have breakout groups where people can discuss issues such as guilt and shame and all the things that come up. White people can ask about Black people. Really, what's it like if I gave you these slaveholding records? How would you respond? And you can sort of practice your communication. We try to break down barriers, and of course have fun while we're doing it. So.
Yeah, and I think the important piece too, and I've had to reiterate this with a couple of people, and I've gotten with time to see that work out for them. And most people wanted something to be immediate and for them to be able to immediately help and immediately repair. And sometimes that's just not how it goes. But it takes time. So sometimes you've got to follow up with people. Some people don't check their Ancestry accounts or 23andMe accounts as frequently as you might once you're in the zone doing something. And so they may read it and be like, oh, they're not ready to address that. They're not ready to dive into that with you. But if you follow up with them again and go, hey, I saw you saw my message. I just wanted to reach out again to offer you this information or to talk about it if you're open. That second time might be when someone responds to you. But if you never go back, you never get to make amends that way or whatever way you were considering or getting an answer to your question. Like Lotte said, I have a whole stroke of luck with this. One of the guys that I cold emailed from, I think that was maybe MyHeritage or Family Tree DNA. He has the surname of my great-great-grandfather, which the only thing I have about him is his name and estimated time of the year of when he was born, and that he was a white man that did not marry my 2 times great-grandmother, but still produced my great-grandmother. he still has that surname. I reached out to him email. He asked about a phone call. We talked the next day. And before the end of the week, I had a whole package of all of the ancestry stuff that he had paid ancestry genealogists to do that took his tree back to 1673 when the three brothers immigrated here and moved here to be colonists here in Maryland. And if I had never sent an email, I would have never have that. Now, granted, I have a lot more work to do to tease out some of that to get to my direct ancestor, but I have a whole lot more to start with because I went out on a limb and email to ask.
So how did you overcome that hesitancy? Because I get really, I don't bothering folks. I haven't messaged anyone just per se, except for maybe people that I know. But
I feel like I've gotten a little fearless at this point where I'm like, the worst somebody can tell you is no or not answer. Now, if you told me I had to walk up to somebody, like something they got it in their purse, and I got to walk up to them and say, hey, let me have what's in your purse, that might be a different situation. But send an email, sure, why not? I send emails all day. I send emails for work all day. It's another one to hit send on. And if they pop up and reply, then that's great. And if not, you keep it moving. I keep a note, in those different genealogy programs of people I emailed and when, and sometimes I'll even copy what I put in. And I think too, it helps to have a standard kind of little message that you send to people so that you don't have to have the weight of writing something from scratch every time. So I have like a standard script I use, and that way all I have to do is sub out the surnames, if I even have to do that, and I can literally just copy paste the email, hit send, and sometimes I'll send 5 or 10 in a night as I'm going through a list of new people that have popped up or anything like that, and just keep moving.
So as you can tell, we could probably talk all night long until 5 in the morning and not run out of things to say or enthusiasm or silly jokes. But I think we're about out of time. But so we'll turn it back over to Diane, to you and Judith. And boy, I sure just want to thank everybody for having us.
Thank you for being here. Will you come back? We're looking for you to come back. Yeah. Well, Judith, do you have anything to add?
Just if people still are interested in coming to the table, check out the national website, comingtothetable.org, or if you want to write us directly in Charlottesville, comingtothetable@gmail.com. So this was great presentation, Lotte and Briayna. So glad you're here. And I look forward to follow-up. Yes?
We have I called her like the mother of our genealogy research. Dr. Shelley Murphy's here. She's our expert. She's our community expert. And she says, thanks, it was a good discussion. And coming from her, boy, I say that's great.
I will take that as high praise.
Yes. Yes. So we're looking forward to you coming back. And Carolyn, we're kind of not good for time, too good for time right now, are we?
We're at the close. We're at the close. Thank you all so much for all your time and for everyone's attention. This has been amazing.
Yes.
And thank you too, Carolyn, and the center for having us.
You bet. You bet.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And I mean, if y'all are picking up doing stuff in Virginia, you've got ancestors in Virginia. Virginia and Maryland history intertwines a lot. So you might come across some of my ancestors.
Right. I probably have and just don't know it. All right. Well,
all right. Everyone have a good night.
For coming.
Thank you so much.
I see
Thank you.
Sister and my grub friends, and I'm just very thankful that they are here